Welcome back, everybody, to our second session on mental health. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Helge Frieling as our next speaker. Helge is a professor in molecular psychiatry in Medical School Hanover and is one of the leading German researchers in the area of psychiatric epigenetics. As a scientist and a clinician, he is devoted to the advancement of personalized treatment of patients, and this also gave us an opportunity to work with him in the future lab, where we are collaborating on a psychiatric data project. Helge, the floor is all yours. I'm looking forward to your great talk.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Marga, for the introduction and for inviting me. And I plan to give you a short introduction into why I think that we are in need of new ideas to improve mental health, and why I think that the use of big data and AI may be a way to move forward towards precision psychiatry. And the basic idea that I came to think about this, or thinking about this, is that we know that people are completely different, and the question is, why should we treat them all the same? And that is basically what the current guidelines are telling us. And the idea of precision psychiatry is that we want to treat every patient individually with the best treatment available for this patient's needs, and we are at the moment far away from doing this. And I want to walk you through some of the things where we are currently standing. And the first thing that comes to our mind when we think about mental health is that we are talking about certain diagnoses like depression or bipolar disorders or schizophrenia or dementia. And we should be aware that these diagnostic categories are were mainly defined in the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. And they are mainly defined not basically on the phenomenology that was seen, but in many cases on ideas how these disorders might be explainable. And therefore, we have very heterogeneous symptom constellations that can be regarded as one of these categorical disorders. And we learned, and I hope you will learn this during my talk, we learned that these categories are not in all cases very helpful to understand mental health and to better cure our patients. So that's mainly today's view, that these are rather rough classifications of heterogeneous symptoms and also heterogeneous causes. And we are still missing biologically informed disease concepts, because we are just not discussing, like in heart attack, that we know there's a vessel that is blocked, and then there's ischemia of the heart muscle, where we can then see where does this come from. But we are talking about pest chain at the moment when we look at psychiatric disorders, and we don't know if it's from the lung or if it's from the heart. And I think that these old concepts are nowadays really impeding relevant progress in understanding and also early diagnostics, interventions, treatment, and also prevention of mental disorders. And if we look at where we stand, then we have to say that the research into the etiology or the origins of psychiatric disorders during the 20th century has mainly been influenced by a conflict between different schools or different concepts. So you probably know that there was a large fight between psychoanalysts on the one hand and behavioral therapeutics therapists and the therapists on the other hand regarding the field of psychotherapy. And in the psychiatry itself, there was a long-standing conflict between biological psychiatrists. They said there is some biological origin, psychiatric disorders have something to do with the brain. And on the other hand, the social psychiatry that try to explain all the problems of mental health with the social environment, the job or unemployment or societal things in general. And I think it's something that really happened during the last 20 to 30 years, that somehow we came together and learned that it's not possible, or we don't make progress in understanding mental disorders if we look only at one side, or if we only look through the eyes of a psychoanalyst. but we need to look at the whole story and look at it from different angles. And one of the main hallmarks that made it possible to look at psychiatric disorders like we do it now has been already in the early 80s, when the American Psychiatric Association published the third volume of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the DSM, which is mainly the catalog of psychiatric disorders with a definition of the different disorders. And the DSM-3 introduced a radical change in the definition of psychiatric disorders, because they completely left the idea that we are talking about etiologies. I'm not talking about the schizophrenic mothers or the different causes of depression, but we are just looking at the syndromal or phenomenological level. Like, we're looking at which symptoms are there, and the DSM introduced operationalized criteria, so that you now can say I have certain symptoms like anhedonia and depressed mood, and maybe a problem in the drive, so that we are able to diagnose a major depression. And what is also new in the 80s is that you can have different psychiatric disorders at the same time. All concepts before said there is something like a hierarchy of disorders. So if you have a psychosis and you have affective symptoms, then it's not possible that you also have an affective disorder, but it's part of the psychosis and so on. So this completely changed the picture, but the disorder categories basically remained the same. So some new disorders like bulimia and ADHD have been introduced afterwards, but it's mainly schizophrenia, addiction, depression, bipolar disorder, dementia, like we had before. And looking at the current stand of the psychopharmacology, we know that the introduction of antidepressants and antipsychotics in the second half of this 20th century was had a huge impact on mental health, and is still a very important thing that happened. And I always show this slide because I think it's really something that gives a good impression. So this is a chart from an inpatient residency in Chicago, where people with mental disorders were hospitalized, so they lived there forever. And you see that it's increasing all the time. More people were there, so they were not on the streets anymore. And when chlorpromazine as the first antipsychotic was introduced in the early 50s, then it was the treatment of these patients was possible, symptom control was possible, and therefore it was possible to dehospitalize and have these psychiatric asylums closed down and bring the people back to the community. So this was a huge success, and and the psychopharmacological revolution made the social psychiatry possible, which many social psychiatrists don't want to hear anymore, but it already shows that you can't look at it only from one side. It's so intertwined. But what also happened is that once we had the possibility to treat certain symptoms like depression or schizophrenia, the pharmacological principles behind these drugs also shaped the way of thinking about these disorders. So we know that the antidepressants, the early tricyclic antidepressants, block the reuptake of certain neurotransmitters like serotonin or norepinephrine. And yeah, if you block the reuptake, you increase the level of these monoamines, and if you increase them and this leads to an antidepressant effect, then the basic idea is that, okay, there must be something of that you have not enough monoamines, and this was the birth of the monoamine hypothesis of depression, which is still around, which people still are told in medical schools, which is one of the underlying causes of depression, which is actually not holding true. And the second example is that we know that all substances that are working as antipsychotic agents are blocking the dopamine 2 receptor, and that was the birth for the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, which led to a shift in the conceptualization of schizophrenia that only looked at the positive symptoms, only looked at delusions and hallucinations, and overlooked the much more problematic negative symptoms that the patients suffer from. So we see, okay, there was some progress, but we are still working in the thinking of these old disorder categories. But if we look at where was psychiatry 20 years ago, then I would have told you, okay, we have very good accepted, good defined disorder categories. Our goals are that people don't suffer from symptoms, that they don't relapse into the disorder, and that we increase the quality of life. And the basic concept is we have good concept, and that will help most of the patients. So we never talked about actually curing certain disorders. We're always talking about helping people to live with it in a good way. But psychiatry was very confident that there is some problem with the implementation, and if we reach all the patients, then it will be good. And then we learned from mainly the first trial that showed that this view may not be right, and there are others, but this one is really one of the main points where the whole field started to look different at what we are doing, is the StartE trial, which was done by performed in the United States. It's a large therapy algorithm trial, and the idea was that they tried to find a perfect algorithm to treat every patient. And they did this with over 4,000 patients with depression that were outpatients, and every second week it was tested if symptoms were completely remitted, and if not, then you advance to the next level. And once this started, everybody was really confident that we can show that at level 3 we will have helped most of the persons, and if we advance further, then we really help every patient that suffers from depression. But then we saw the remission rates, and it was shown that in level 1 only 1/3 of the patients was remitting, and at level 2 it's again only 30%. And if you have the first 2 trials that are not working, then it's highly improbable that you will reach remission at all. So we are helping on a symptomatic level only 2/3 of the patients. So the probability to remain depressed is very high if you advance to the higher levels. And we learned that we are only helping part of the patients. And if we look closer at it and look at what happens after they reach remission, we see that many people are having a relapse during the first year of treatment. So you see the longer it takes to get into remission, the earlier you have the relapse, but also those that were responding in the first level, more than half of them had the next depressive episode during the next year. So we learned that probably our treatment is not the best for the patient at the moment, but it's still the best we have. And one of the main problems that we are facing in psychiatry when we are looking not only at drugs, but also at psychotherapeutic treatments, stimulation therapies, all the other forms of therapies, we do not have real good ideas which form of therapy we should use for which patient. So what we are doing, especially looking at our guidelines, we use the same therapy for everybody. If you have a depression, then our current national guideline says you should be treated with an antidepressant first, and if it's severe depression, you should also receive psychotherapy. And yeah, like we learned, the probability that we are successful with this is like around 30%, and the rest needs other therapies. And the ultimate goal of precision psychiatry should be that we find out which patients, or find out groups of patients which are responding to therapy A and other patients that are responding to therapy B, and we do not need to treat everybody first with A, then with B, then with C, and then with D, with the probability that some patients are dying on the way until we find a successful therapy for them. Okay. But then if we are saying, okay, these are subtypes, for example, of depression, then it's again, we are still in the context of our diagnostic criteria or diagnostic categories, our old disorders. And we're still talking about the symptomatic level, which is already good, but I think we can go further from there, because like if we look at subtypes of these disorders, then these are again subtypes that are conceptualized in the 19th century. If we look at the evidence from genetic, imaging, pharmacological, neuropsychological, or electrophysiological, and most studies that are done, showing that common phenotypes may have different underlying causes, and the same cause may lead to different phenotypes. So it's possible that if we are sticking with our diagnosis, so that we might impede that we treat the actual cause of the disease and actually also cure the disease. And we have one very good example. We learned 15 years ago that there are certain types of typical brain inflammation, like NMDA antibody positive encephalitis, which in half of the cases exactly looks like a schizophrenia. And many people with schizophrenia, around 10% that are in the wards with the suspect of schizophrenia having some form of brain inflammation, which can be cured, which can be treated with an immunological therapy, and this disorder is going away, or it can be cured with in a surgical way because it's caused by certain kinds. But most of these people are normally treated as schizophrenia and just treated on the symptomatic level, and they are not cured, but the symptom is somehow controlled. So we learned that there are causes to our disorders, at least part of the disorder, which could be treated in a completely different way. And the next thing that we learned is that we have a very, very high genetic overlap between diagnoses. So this is one of the main from one of the main publications of the Psychiatric Genetic Consortium. Performed very large GWAS analysis of different disorders, and on one day they said, well, maybe we should take the different cohorts together and see how much overlap do we have there. And then we learned the most genetic overlap between these diagnoses of autism, ADHD, bipolar, and unipolar, and schizophrenia, and that we have much more genetic homogeneity if we look at all these diagnoses together. So there's much more uniting these diagnoses than that is differing between these on the genetic level, and we also see this on other levels. The idea arose that it might make sense to find other classifiers that can help us better to find better phenotypes that are biological base and maybe have a direct effect on the on potential treatment outcome. And there is one very good case from the Schizophrenia Network on intermediate phenotypes. It's also a North American study where around 2,000 participants were recruited with like 700 patients that were diagnosed with either schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective disorder, very closely schizophrenia. And recruited first-grade relatives in all cases and some healthy controls. And then they did biological and behavioral characteristics with neuropsychology, eye tracking, and different physiological tasks. And there were also some external validation measures like social functioning was assessed. There was the clinical information. All of the patients and all of the participants received a structural MRI, and then other biomarkers were also performed in the first-grade relatives. And the idea is that we have different biotypes that are distributed across the disorders. So they said, okay, it doesn't go for these disorders. We take different, like we say, these are all suffering from psychosis with some kinds of delusion, hallucinations, delusions, hallucinations mainly. And then they tested if they can use some of the measures they got, and they used cognitive control and the sensory motor reactivity to see if they can put these participants into different biotypes. They cluster together. Found that there are indeed 3 groups that can be identified and that can be distinguished from each other, are called 1, 2, and 3 in this case. And you see this is ones are the biotype 1, those are those with the largest problems with the social functioning, with the job impairments, or living alone, or not be able to live in silence. And the green ones, which are very indistinct from the controls, are those with the lowest symptoms and the lowest social burden. And if you see how this is different, while if you take the normal, the distribution of the diagnosis that we use, it doesn't look like you can classify them somehow. And if you take these biotypes, and look at the neuroimaging, in this case, voxel-based morphometry, you see the strongest impairments also is the biotype with the strongest reduction in the gray matter volume. It's known that this can happen in psychosis, while biotype 3, which with the lowest effects, is also not showing very strong changes in gray matter or in the brain. And so the authors there argue that it might make sense to use these phenotypes or these intermediate phenotypes also for on the therapeutic level, who needs which kind of therapy, which kind of social support, so that we can differ at least in these patients and not look at who this is bipolar disorder, so we need to treat it like the guidelines have for bipolar disorder. And this is something that we really see on the wards. In often cases, it's hard to tell if it's a schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder once they are really psychotic, and maybe it doesn't even matter for the treatment. And for the long-term treatment, other parameters might be much more relevant for that. So again, what we learned here is that these heterogeneous phenotypes that our diagnosis are, that are lacking a consistent genetic background and distinct biomarker profiles and lacking a unification. So we need to go beyond these categorical diagnoses. And what I think why I'm so happy to be the AI Future Lab and why we are thinking a lot about big data approaches, that we have a lot of and that we could use to subclassify our patients or classify our patients. We want to end there that we our mix of patients where we do can have a lot of data starting from the clinical data, which can be made available, going to omics data on the biological data, going like imaging data can be used, or environmental data, which also gained a lot of attention during the last years. And then with the use of algorithms and computer magic, not my, but more years, I hope that we can that we are able to distinguish certain groups with similar disorders, and then in the next step we can find treatments that are helping these patients, which may be helpful for other patients, so that in the end we will not only help 2/3 of the patients on the symptomatic level, but maybe to cure the disorders in a large proportion of the patients, to use the correct treatment for others for the control, maybe treatments that have less side effects or less disability, and therefore helping people to return to a healthy mental in an easier way. So this is my my impulse reference to give you an idea why I think big data is a very, very important thing to use to improve mental health and the quality of care that we provide for people with psychiatric disorders. And by that, I'm glad to thank you for your attention, and looking forward to any questions.
Thanks a lot, Helge. Time for questions. Helge, you can unshare your slides.
Yeah, on the way.
So I'll remind the attendees that they can raise their hand. Teams functionality, won't be able to write in the chat. If they have any question, please raise your hand. There is one hand raised, but the participant is current, so I cannot really unmute the participant. Okay. So maybe I start with the question. So you mentioned that there could be some biological mental health problem, right? So there could be some genetic mutation, some evidence you could find in omics. I was wondering if that's the case, then do you already observe in these patients direct consequences on health? Because if there are changes in protein, there would be changes in protein functions, which might lead to certain other problems. So I'm not talking about the indirect consequences. Of course, mentally unhealthy people would not take care of their physical health also. There would be indirect consequences, but maybe is there a way to, or do you have any evidence of direct connection physical health to mental health, or different subtypes, different mental disorders lead to different kind of health problems?
Well, there are several different answers to this question. I will try to summarize it with two things. We know that there's a very large between psychiatric disorders and somatic disorders. We know that this is a part of the indirect effect because, like you said, people with schizophrenia are smoking very much and are not eating healthy, and they are not doing sports, so they are likely to have a lot of cardiovascular problems. But even we know that even if they are not smoking, if they are physically healthy, leading a healthy lifestyle, they have an increased risk for example, cardiovascular disorders. And we also know that this is true for depression, where there is at least a subgroup with a very strong interaction between especially cardiovascular and metabolic disorders and depression. And we can see that even in depressed patients, patients with the unipolar depression in the early 20s, you can see that they already have signs of disturbed glucose metabolism, which then later leads probably to diabetes. So this is somehow intertwined already, and it's not the cause of the depression is not leading to bad lifestyle that then leads to the diabetes. So I think there are a lot of cues that show that this is really much more intertwined than we thought earlier on. And on the other hand, we have like these clear evidence from certain purely genetic disorders that are leading to a schizophrenic phenotype. There are some like copy number variants, which like 11q22 syndrome, which has a schizophrenic phenotype with psychosis and also negative symptoms and everything. It looks like schizophrenia, but these are also suffering from disformations of the heart and sometimes disformations of the face, which is basically explainable through the same genes that are affected there. So this is, and we see this, we will think that probably 10 to even 20% of all cases diagnosed with schizophrenia have a pure genetic background with copy number or structural variations, and they it's often the case that they also have some somatic disturbances there.
Thanks. Maybe I'll ask later on. I have a follow-up question, but there is one question from our participant. I'll unmute you. So, Ojasvi, you can now unmute yourself and also open your camera. You can ask your question now. You should be.
Thank you, Megha.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Megha. Helge, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It also, my question, I hope I'm audible here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So the presentation reminded me of epigenetics and its role in psychological disorders. One question that I've had during my research on it that I still would like you to think, like, if you have any opinions on it. There are multiple contributing factors. Am I audible?
Yes, you were.
Yeah, we hear.
Now you're audible.
Yeah, great. So the multiple contributing factors that like act as triggers for people who are prone to be more psychologically activated. Rather, I mean, when it comes to, apologize for my use of terminology, but so for people who have a higher probability of schizophrenia, autism, and they have environmental factors that sort of can contribute to the activation of this sort of a disease. I was wondering, is it easy to like isolate on the, because it's usually a multifactorial problem, right? There's say eating habits, there is emotional trauma, or a bunch of other things that can contribute. How can we possibly figure out the majority cause for something that has activated their condition?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I'm not sure if it's possible to find something like a majority cause, because I think we know what we are doing at the moment is always to do case control studies. Like we take 100 patients with depression and we take 100 controls, and then we see, okay, the patients with depression had more like childhood trauma. They were a little higher as a group. But there are a lot of people without childhood trauma that develop depression, and there are a lot of people with childhood trauma that are not developing depression. And what we are currently still not able to say is, okay, why is it like that? So and everybody's looking, in most cases, we are looking at one factor, like childhood trauma, but you would need to see also, okay, what were the protective factors, for example, who had, and what kind of childhood trauma, so we know for sure that there are differences between emotional neglect and physical abuse, for example. And I think the more differentiated we look at it, the more we learn, or we see that it's not attributable to one single thing. So this is really multifactorial. And the problem is, but on the other hand, we are taking, like I said, 100 patients with depression and compare them with the 100 controls. But like I think right. These patients with 100 patients with depressions are probably having at least 5 different groups of people with different disorders that have the same phenotype in the end. So there might be some that have like a depression that is attributable to the childhood trauma, but there are some others that have like a pure genetic depression, and there are the next ones that do not have depression but a personality disorder that looks like a depression at that moment. So that is one of the main problems we have at the moment with all the research into the origins of the disorders, that our disorder categories are, in my view, are way too broad, and they are not reflected by the neurobiology, for example. So that's why we are trying to do it the other way around, that we say we take a lot of people with certain things, and we try to find, for example, homogeneous subgroups that are genetically more homogeneous, or that are more homogeneous in regard to some biomarkers, and then do the phenotyping afterwards to see how do these groups differ.
Understood. Thank you. That actually confirms a underlying suspicion I had. I have a follow-up question, but I'm happy to give some, if someone else has to ask.
I think there are 2 more questions in the line. Nagaranjan, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask your question. Maybe we go ahead with Zhao till Nagarajan fixes the issue. Zhao, you can go ahead with your question now. Just unmute yourself and you can ask your question. Zhao Ren. Okay. Zhao, do you have a question, Zhao Ren? Okay. Maybe or just you can ask your follow-up question.
Thank you. I was wondering, I've read in certain studies that the way they're accessing the gene sample, some of them are doing through frontal cortex, some of them are doing through blood. And I wanted to understand what is the difference in quality of data that you achieve from these different modalities. And another one was, there is another conversation, parallel conversation happening around the reversibility of a disease, like say bipolar disorder, or even sorry for the noise. If we make changes in lifestyle or other, the same gene expression, if we stop the trigger. So I was wondering if what were your thoughts around this?
Okay, regarding the first question, if you look at pure genetics, it doesn't matter where the DNA comes from because it should be more or less the same in every cell of the same organism. But if we're looking at the DNA methylation, then we know that there are large differences between the different tissue types, like between certain brain regions, and even between different cell types within the brain, that methylation profiles can be different. But we also learned that a lot of the larger changes that are associated with, like early life stress, are reflected also in the blood. So as brain is not that easily accessible in patients, we normally have to refer to blood, because if you look at postmortem brain tissues, then you have a lot of different technical problems, and also the problem that these persons are already dead, so you have a special population.
Right.
Regarding the reversibility, as like we know, for example, if you look at unipolar depression at patients that have lots of episodes, then for the first 2 or 3 episodes, there are some actual triggers that can lead to an actual episode. But after you have suffered 3 episodes, then they will come without that you see any triggers anymore. So there are changes, neurobiological changes taking place when you're depressed. And I think that if we have that there will be certain therapies that really can also reverse some of these changes, so that we can really cure it, that it won't come back. But I think this will all again be different between different patients. So what we are trying at the moment in a cooperation with the Psychopharmacology in Tel Aviv is in an addiction model that we change the methylation and try to see if this has an effect on the behavior. But we do this in rats apparently at the moment. But this is nothing that is soon to be applied in the clinics.
Right. This is fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Helge, for the nice talk and the great discussion afterwards. I'm sorry we cannot take more questions. Please feel free to contact. I'm sure Helge would like to answer any questions by email. We need to move to due to the time constraints, we need to move to the next talk.